The alien princess rejected every suitor. Until a human changed her mind, the grand palace of Verath stood as a monument to the mighty Verathian Empire, its gleaming towers stretching high into the alien sky. The planet itself was a blend of advanced technology and ancient tradition. The palace, surrounded by towering walls of crystal and gold, was home to one of the most powerful royal families in the galaxy. Inside, the air was thick with expectations, whispers, and a sense of destiny. It was here that Princess Solara, daughter of King Ulthar, was expected to make the most important decision of her life. At 25, Solara had reached the age where many princesses across the galaxy would be expected to choose a suitor. Her marriage would not be a simple affair, not just a joining of two hearts, but a political maneuver, a decision that could affect the fate of entire civilizations. Her father, King Ulthar, had seen it all before. He had married for power, for alliances, and had built the empire into something truly remarkable. His daughter, though, seemed different. Solara had been raised with the same expectations of duty and responsibility, but something about her always felt disconnected from the role that was meant for her. Every year, the royal ball was held in the palace to celebrate the princess's coming of age. This year, however, was special. This year, Solara would have to choose. Across the galaxy, powerful suitors had been invited to court the princess. Their ships had arrived weeks ago, each one more magnificent than the last, each one filled with promises of wealth, power, and influence. The suitors were not just from Verathian alliances, but from distant worlds, each eager to claim the princess's hand. Some were warriors, some were diplomats, and others were merchants, each bringing with them gifts designed to dazzle and impress. But Solara did not care for any of it. She watched as the suitors paraded before her, presenting their treasures, their titles, and their proposals. She was polite, of course, as was expected of her, but inside she felt nothing but the heavy weight of obligation. She felt like a prisoner in her own life, shackled by the expectations of her people. She had learned to smile, nod, and accept their compliments without allowing them to touch her heart, for she had seen too much to believe in the sincerity of their gestures. There was one suitor, though, who caught her attention, if only for a moment. His name was Trazoth, a warrior from the distant planet of Zalrith. Tall and strong, his presence commanded the room. He had a reputation as a fearsome fighter, known for his skill with the blade and his leadership on the battlefield. When he stepped into the room, the air seemed to shift. The other suitors fell silent, watching with admiration as Trazoth knelt before the princess. He presented her with a magnificent sword, forged from the rarest metal in the galaxy, its blade shimmering in the light. "A weapon fit for a queen," he said, his voice deep and steady. "With it you will rule with strength and power." Solara could not hide the flicker of annoyance that crossed her face. It was not that she did not appreciate the craftsmanship of the weapon. It was beautiful, after all. But she had no desire to rule through strength alone. Her mind wandered back to the moment her father had presented her with the royal crest when she was just a child. He had told her then that strength was everything, that it was the foundation upon which an empire was built. But Solara had always wondered if there was more to leadership than just strength and power. "Thank you, Trazoth," she said with a forced smile, her voice cool. "Your gift is truly magnificent, but I do not seek to rule through force alone." The warrior's eyes darkened, but he nodded and stood up. "As you wish, princess. I only offer what I know." And with that, he moved on to present his sword to the next guest. Solara's heart sank as she realized the futility of this tradition. Was this what her life had come to? To stand in front of these men, hearing their grand promises, watching them try to win her favor with gifts and speeches. The emptiness inside her grew. It was as though her destiny had already been decided for her, as though she were nothing more than a prize to be won. She had always been a princess, raised in the lap of luxury, surrounded by wealth and beauty, and yet she had never felt so alone. The corridors of the palace were filled with the chatter of visitors, the music from the grand hall echoing through the walls, but none of it reached her. She felt as though she were standing at the edge of a cliff, unable to jump, but too tired to move back. The evening wore on, and more suitors came and went, each one more lavish than the last, each one offering more extravagant gifts. There were jewels from the farthest stars, ships that could sail the universe in a single day, and promises of alliances that could change the balance of power across the galaxy. But for Solara, each gesture seemed emptier than the last. She had never asked for any of this. She had never asked to be born into a life of such grand expectations. All she had ever wanted was to live freely, to choose her own path. But that was not possible, not for a princess, not for someone bound by duty to the empire. The evening drew to a close, and Solara retreated to her private chambers. The sound of laughter and music from the ballroom seemed distant now, muffled by the thick doors that separated her from the outside world. She stood in front of the mirror, gazing at her reflection. Her dark green eyes, so often filled with fire and passion, now looked tired and dull. Her long silver hair fell around her shoulders like a waterfall, but even its beauty seemed lost to her. She had known this moment was coming for years. She had always known that one day she would be forced to make a choice. She would have to choose a suitor, someone who would stand beside her as she took on the mantle of leadership. But she had never imagined it would feel like this. She had never imagined that when the moment came, she would feel so empty. There was a knock on her door. Her personal attendant, Lyra, entered, her face filled with concern. "Your Highness, are you well?" she asked gently. Solara forced a smile, though it did not reach her eyes. "I am fine, Lyra, just tired." The attendant hesitated before speaking again. "You have rejected all the suitors, Your Highness. Is there someone else? A suitor you are waiting for?" Solara's heart twisted in her chest. She had heard the rumors, the whispers that had been growing louder with each passing day. That she was impossible to please. That she was cold, unfeeling, incapable of love. It was true that she had not found anyone who had captured her heart, but how could she explain that to Lyra? How could she explain the ache inside her that nothing seemed to fill? "I do not know what I am waiting for," Solara said softly, turning away from the mirror. "Perhaps nothing at all." Lyra said nothing, but Solara could feel the weight of her gaze. The silence stretched between them, and for a moment, Solara could almost hear the distant echoes of her own thoughts. She could hear the voices of her ancestors, urging her to make a choice, to take her place in history. But she could also hear something else, something quieter, something that said she didn't have to live by the rules of others. It was a voice she didn't fully understand, but it was there. And it was growing louder. Solara stood at the balcony of her chambers, her gaze fixed on the stars beyond the palace walls. The night was quiet, the stars sparkling in the endless sky above, but the quiet did nothing to soothe the turmoil within her. She had been raised to understand the importance of duty, of responsibility, but now she wondered if she could ever truly live up to the expectations placed on her. Her father's voice echoed in her mind, his words about strength and leadership ever present. "The Empire will only survive if we make the right alliances, Solara. You must understand this." She had heard it 1,000 times, but now it felt more like a burden than guidance. The royal ball had been an overwhelming event, full of politics, promises, and people who all seemed to want something from her. The suitors had all come with their grand displays of power, wealth, and prestige, each trying to prove that they were worthy of her. She had played her part, smiling, nodding, and politely rejecting them, but inside she felt a growing sense of emptiness. Was this really her destiny, to be nothing more than a prize to be won, to marry someone she didn't love just to secure an alliance? It didn't seem right, and yet she knew there was no other path for her. But that night, something had been different. Among all the suitors, there was one who had stood out, not because of his wealth nor his power, but because of something far more subtle. A human diplomat named James Connors. He had arrived at the ball with the air of someone who was not trying to impress anyone, not trying to prove himself. He had walked into the room like he belonged there, but not because of his status or his background. He belonged simply because he was himself. At first, Solara had barely noticed him. He was just another guest among hundreds of diplomats, traders, and warriors. But then their eyes had met across the crowded ballroom, and for a brief moment she had felt something stir inside her, a feeling she could not describe, a flicker of curiosity. It wasn't like the admiration she had felt for other suitors. It wasn't about power or status, but something deeper, something that made her want to know more about him. After the ball, Solara had learned that James was there as part of a diplomatic mission from Earth, a planet she had heard little about. Earth was a young, emerging world, far from the established powers of the galaxy. The humans had no empire to speak of, no vast fleets or grand wealth. They were small in comparison to the great civilizations that ruled the galaxy, but there was something in their spirit that caught Solara's attention. It wasn't long before their paths crossed again. The next day, in the palace's grand garden, Solara found herself walking alone beneath the high, sweeping branches of the trees. The garden was a quiet sanctuary, a place where she could think without the constant weight of expectation. As she walked, lost in her thoughts, she heard footsteps behind her. She turned, expecting to see one of the servants or perhaps one of the many courtiers. But it was James, the human diplomat, standing at a distance, his hands behind his back, looking at her with calm eyes. "Princess," he said softly, his voice almost a whisper, "I hope I'm not disturbing you." Solara was taken aback by the sudden appearance, but she did not feel threatened. There was no sense of urgency in his tone, no attempt to impress her or ask for anything. It was simply a greeting. She nodded, gesturing for him to approach. "You're not disturbing me," she replied, her voice light, though there was an edge to it. She had learned to be careful around strangers, especially those who sought to win her favor. But there was something in the way James held himself that made her feel at ease. They stood in silence for a moment, the soft rustle of leaves in the wind the only sound between them. It was strange, Solara thought, how comfortable she felt in his presence. She had spent her life surrounded by people, but this man, who was so different from the others, made her feel as though they were the only two people in the world. Finally, it was James who broke the silence. "I've heard much about your world, Princess." "It's beautiful," he said, his eyes scanning the vast gardens that stretched before them. Solara raised an eyebrow, surprised by his words. Most of the other guests had either focused on her beauty or the grandeur of the palace. They spoke of power, of what her marriage could mean for them, or how her hand could change the course of history. But James was different. He was talking about the beauty of her world, not just the politics surrounding her. "Thank you," she said softly, though she still felt somewhat guarded. "I often forget how peaceful it can be here." James nodded, and there was a pause before he spoke again. "I can imagine it must be difficult, the weight of the crown, the expectations, the suitors." Solara's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't expected him to speak so directly about her life. Most people tried to avoid talking about her burden, afraid of saying the wrong thing. But here was James, acknowledging it without hesitation. "I don't understand your position, Princess," James continued, "but I can see that you carry a heavy weight. No one should have to make such a choice based on what others want." Solara felt a rush of emotions at his words, a mix of frustration and longing. How could he possibly understand? How could anyone understand the pressure of being born into royalty, of being told every day that you must marry for the good of the empire, that you must put duty above everything else? But instead of pushing him away, she found herself wanting to talk. She hadn't had a true conversation with anyone in years, not since her childhood friends had grown distant, their lives now revolving around the political games they were all forced to play. She hesitated for only a moment before speaking. "You're right," she said quietly. "Sometimes I wonder if I'll ever have the freedom to choose what I want, who I want, without it being a decision for my people, for the empire." "But what choice do I have?" Her voice was tinged with sadness, though she tried to mask it with a stoic expression. James looked at her with understanding, his gaze steady and kind. "You always have a choice, Princess, even when it feels like you don't. It's just not always an easy one." There was something in his voice, something that made her believe him. She couldn't remember the last time someone had spoken to her like that. Most people saw her as a symbol, a prize to be won, a tool to be used for political gain. But here was a man who saw her as a person, a woman struggling with the same doubts and fears that anyone might have. Solara looked away, her eyes tracing the lines of the distant horizon. She wasn't sure what she was feeling anymore, but she knew that something inside her was shifting. She had never felt this way before, so open, so vulnerable. And yet, for some reason, it felt right. For the first time in a long while, she felt like she wasn't being judged, like she wasn't being forced to live up to anyone's expectations. It was a strange feeling, one she wasn't sure she knew how to navigate. "I'm not sure what I'm supposed to do anymore," she said, almost to herself. "I don't know what the right choice is. I don't even know if I can make a choice at all." James's voice was gentle when he spoke again. "Maybe the right choice isn't the one that everyone expects. Maybe it's the one that feels right to you, even if it's hard." Solara turned her gaze back to him, meeting his eyes for the first time with full intensity. There was something about the way he spoke that made her believe he truly understood. She wasn't sure why or how, but in that moment it felt like she could trust him. "I don't know if I can make a choice like that," she admitted, "but I wish I could." James gave her a soft smile, one that reached his eyes. Maybe you can, just take it one step at a time. Solara watched him for a moment longer, her heart heavy with uncertainty. But something inside her began to shift, just a little. Perhaps, for the first time, she was beginning to believe that there was more to life than duty and power. Perhaps there was more to her future than a marriage of convenience. The days that followed were like a blur to Solara. The palace continued its usual bustle, filled with meetings, events, and the endless parade of suitors. But her mind often wandered back to the brief conversation she had shared with James in the garden. There was something about his words that had stayed with her, something that had struck a chord deep within her. For the first time in a long time, she felt as if she were being treated like a person, not just a princess with a duty to fulfill. It was not that Solara hadn't heard such words before. She had been told that she should follow her heart, that she should seek happiness. But those words had always come from people who did not understand the true weight of her responsibilities. They came from those who had the luxury of choosing their own paths, free from the constraints of tradition and duty. But James, with his quiet sincerity, had made her wonder if it was possible to find a way to do both, to fulfill her duty and still follow her heart. She didn't know why, but when she thought about him, she felt a strange sense of calm. It wasn't love, not yet at least, but something else, a connection. She could not explain it, but she knew she hadn't felt anything like it in years. The constant pressure of her position had made it difficult for her to connect with anyone, to let anyone see her as something more than just the future ruler of Veyrath. But James had done something different. He had seen her, really seen her, without judgment, without expectation, and that made all the difference. The palace, however, had no time for such thoughts. Solara's father, King Ulthar, had called for another meeting with the royal advisors. The weight of the empire was heavy on his shoulders, and the political landscape of the galaxy was constantly shifting. He needed to secure a powerful marriage for Solara, one that would ensure the Veyrathian Empire remained a dominant force in the galaxy. The suitors had been paraded before her for weeks, each one more eager than the last, but none of them had stirred anything in her. Her father could see it in her eyes. He knew she wasn't interested in any of them. As Solara sat at the table during the meeting, she listened as the advisors spoke of the various alliances they could form. They discussed the strength of this race's military, the wealth of another, the political leverage they could gain from such and such marriage. It was all so cold, so calculated. She felt a wave of frustration rise in her chest. This was her life they were talking about, her future, yet all they saw was a means to an end. "Princess," one of the advisors, a tall, thin man with gray hair, spoke up. "It is clear that none of the suitors we've presented have met your approval. But you must understand, the political situation demands that we make a choice soon. The fate of the Empire depends on it." Solara looked at him, her expression calm but her mind swirling. She had heard this all before, the Empire, the duty, the future. It was always the same. But for once she didn't want to be a piece on the chessboard. She wanted to be the one making the moves. "I understand, Advisor Veldon," she replied, her voice steady. "But I cannot marry just for the sake of politics, I won't." There was a moment of silence, and then her father spoke. His voice was firm, but there was a hint of concern behind it. "Solara, you are not a child, you know the stakes. The Empire is vast, but it is fragile. We must secure our future, and that requires alliances. You cannot ignore this responsibility." Solara met her father's gaze. She had grown up under his tutelage, learning the ways of diplomacy, strategy, and leadership. She knew that the Empire's survival depended on the choices they made. But that didn't make it any easier to accept. "I understand the responsibility, father," she said quietly. "But I cannot marry someone I do not choose. I will not live a life dictated by politics alone." Her father's eyes softened for a moment, but he quickly masked it with the mask of a ruler. "You will do what is necessary, Solara. The Empire cannot wait." The conversation continued, but Solara felt detached from it. She had heard enough. She didn't need anyone to tell her what was best for the Empire. She knew what she wanted, and it was not the life they were offering her. That night, after the meeting had ended, Solara found herself wandering the palace halls. The soft glow of the moonlight filtered through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the floor. She had never felt more alone. The weight of her father's expectations pressed down on her, and the voices of the advisors echoed in her ears. She had to make a choice, but the choice felt impossible. Her footsteps led her outside, to the garden where she had met James days earlier. The garden was quiet now, the only sound the soft rustling of the leaves in the breeze. As she walked along the winding path, she saw a figure standing near the fountain, their back to her. For a moment she thought it was just one of the palace servants, but then she recognized him, James. He turned as he heard her approach, his expression unreadable at first. But when he saw who it was, a small smile tugged at the corner of his lips. "Princess," he said softly, his voice carrying through the night air. Solara couldn't help but smile back. She had not expected to see him again, but in that moment she was glad he was there. "You're not at the ball," she remarked, stepping closer. James shrugged. "I was exactly the star of the show," he said with a half-smile. "I'm just here for the diplomatic mission, not for the glitter and glam." Solara chuckled softly, and for the first time in days she felt a small weight lift from her shoulders. "You've made that clear," she said, the tension easing from her voice. "But I suppose that's why I wanted to speak with you. To talk to someone who doesn't treat me like a pawn." James's expression grew more serious, and he stepped closer, his eyes meeting hers. "I don't think you're a pawn, Solara," he said, his voice low and sincere. "I think you're someone who has to make impossible decisions every day, but I also think you're someone who deserves to make your own choice." Solara felt a flicker of something inside her, a spark of hope. Maybe it was foolish, maybe it was naive, but for the first time she felt like she wasn't alone in this. There was someone who understood, someone who saw her for who she truly was, not just as a princess, not just as a symbol. "I don't know if I can," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know if I can choose my own path." James's gaze softened, and he took a step closer. "You can, you don't have to choose between duty and yourself. You can find a way to do both. It's not easy, but it's possible." Solara met his eyes, and for the first time in a long time she felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, she could find a way to make her own choice, to live for herself, not just for the empire. But as much as she wanted to believe him, the reality of her situation hit her again. Her father's words echoed in her mind. The empire was fragile. The political landscape was constantly shifting. Could she really risk everything for the sake of her own happiness? "I'm not sure I can risk it all," Solara said, her voice filled with uncertainty. James reached out, placing a hand gently on her shoulder. "You don't have to risk everything, Solara. You just have to make the choice that's right for you. And I'll be here whatever that choice is." For a moment, they stood in silence, the weight of the universe pressing down on her. Solara knew that the decision ahead would not be easy, but for the first time, she felt like she might be able to face it. The days following their conversation in the garden felt like a turning point for Solara. There was a quiet shift inside her, something she had not expected. James's words had stirred something deep within her, a sense of hope, of possibility. She had always believed that her life was mapped out for her, that her path was fixed, bound by the weight of the empire and the expectations of those around her. But now, for the first time, she wondered if there might be another way. Could she have both, her duty to her people and her right to choose her own destiny? Yet, despite the hope that James had sparked in her, the pressure of the situation remained. Her father was relentless in his desire for her to choose a suitor. The advisors continued to push for a decision, and the suitors were still arriving, each one more eager than the last. Every day, Solara felt the walls closing in around her, the weight of her responsibilities growing heavier. The pressure was not just from her father or the council, it was from her own heart. She had spent so many years burying her emotions, suppressing her desires for the good of the empire, that she wasn't sure who she truly was anymore. She knew she had a duty, but she also knew that she couldn't live a life dictated solely by the needs of others. The thought of marrying someone she didn't love, someone who didn't understand her, made her stomach turn. But could she really turn her back on everything she had been taught? Could she truly abandon the traditions that had shaped her life? As much as she tried to push the thoughts away, they wouldn't leave her. She spent long hours wandering the palace halls, staring out over the vast gardens, lost in thought. The constant whirlwind of court life had become a blur, and every new suitor who came before her felt more like a stranger than the last. None of them seemed to see her as a person, as a woman with dreams and fears of her own. They only saw her as a symbol, a means to an end. One afternoon, Solara found herself alone in the royal library, the silence of the room a welcome escape from the chaos of the palace. She wandered between the shelves, her fingers brushing over the spines of ancient books, the stories of her ancestors written in the language of her people. The library had always been a place of refuge for her, a place where she could lose herself in the history and wisdom of her world. But today, she found little comfort in the pages of the books. She knew the stories all too well, the stories of powerful rulers and their alliances, the tales of sacrifices made for the greater good. But what about her own story? What about the life she wanted to live? As she turned to leave, she found herself standing at the window, looking out over the sprawling gardens. The bright blue sky stretched out endlessly, and for a moment, Solara felt the weight of it all lift. She closed her eyes, taking a deep breath, trying to calm the storm inside her. She needed to make a choice, but she didn't know if she was ready. Just as she was about to leave, she heard a soft knock on the door. She turned, startled, and saw a familiar face standing in the doorway. "James." "Princess," he said, his voice calm and steady. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." Solara smiled faintly, relieved to see him. "Not at all, I was just thinking." James stepped inside, his eyes scanning the room before resting on her. "I've noticed you've been doing a lot of that lately. Thinking, I mean," she sighed, sitting down at the large wooden desk in the center of the room. "It's hard not to, with everything going on." James nodded, his expression softening. "I can only imagine. It must be difficult, the pressure, the choices you have to make." Solara met his gaze, her heart heavy. "I don't know what to do anymore. The more I think about it, the more impossible it feels. Every decision I make feels like it's for someone else, not for me. I don't know who I am without all these expectations." James walked over to her, stopping just a few feet away. "Maybe you're not meant to have all the answers right away. You're facing a difficult decision, one that no one else can make for you, but the fact that you're questioning it, that's a good sign. It means you care. It means you want something different, and that's important." Solara's eyes searched his face, her emotions swirling. "I want so much. I want to be more than just a figurehead, more than just a symbol of power, but I don't know if I can have that. I don't know if it's possible." James looked at her with a softness in his eyes, his voice low but sincere. "Anything is possible, Solara. If you truly want something different, you can make it happen. It won't be easy and there will be sacrifices, but you're strong enough to find your way." She closed her eyes, her heart aching at his words. They were so simple, yet so powerful. For the first time in a long time, she felt a sense of clarity, a small spark of hope. Maybe she could do this. Maybe she didn't have to choose between duty and her own happiness. Maybe there was a way to do both, but the reality of the situation still loomed large. Her father would never understand. The council would never agree. The empire was built on alliances, on the strength of marriage. If she chose her own path, she could lose everything. The thought of turning her back on the empire, on everything her father had worked for, was terrifying. "I don't know if I'm brave enough," Solara whispered, her voice barely audible. "I don't know if I can risk everything." James stepped closer, his presence steady and reassuring. "You don't have to do it alone. I'll be here no matter what you decide. You don't have to face this by yourself." Her heart skipped a beat. She hadn't realized how much she needed to hear those words. For so long, she had been trapped in a world where she had to be strong, where she had to bear the weight of everything alone. But now, for the first time, she didn't feel so alone. There was someone who cared, someone who was willing to stand by her side, no matter what. "I don't know what to do," she admitted, her voice trembling slightly. "But I can't keep living like this. I need to make a decision for myself." James nodded. "You'll figure it out. You don't need to have all the answers right now. Just take it one step at a time." Solara looked out the window again, her gaze lost in the distance. The choice ahead of her was overwhelming. But in this moment, with James standing by her side, she felt a sense of possibility she hadn't felt in years. Maybe, just maybe, she could find a way to live the life she wanted. A life where she was more than just a princess. A life where she was free to be herself. The thought was both exhilarating and terrifying. She had spent so much time being the perfect princess, the dutiful daughter, the future ruler. But now, she was beginning to wonder if there was more to her life than just fulfilling the expectations of others. She wanted to choose her own path, even if it meant stepping into the unknown. "I don't know what the future holds," Solara said quietly, "but I know I can't keep living in the shadow of other people's choices." James smiled softly. "Then you're already on your way, Solara. You're already taking the first step." Solara stood up, her heart lighter than it had been in days. The decision ahead of her was still daunting, but for the first time she felt like she had the strength to face it. She didn't have to have all the answers now. She just had to keep moving forward. "Thank you, James," she said softly. "I don't know what I would do without you." James's smile deepened, his eyes full of warmth. "You don't have to do anything alone, Solara. You're not alone in this." For the first time in a long time, Solara believed him. She wasn't alone. And maybe, just maybe, she could find a way to live the life she had always dreamed of. The days following their conversation in the library were some of the most difficult Solara had ever experienced. The pressure to choose a suitor to secure the future of the empire weighed heavily on her every step. She could feel the eyes of the entire kingdom on her, the whispers of the court, the expectations of her father. Every conversation she had seemed to come back to the same topic, her marriage, her future. And still, the decision loomed larger and larger. But amidst the noise, amidst the endless stream of suitors and advisors, one voice stood out, James's voice. The more she thought about their conversations, the more certain she became that what he had told her was true. She had a choice. It was a hard choice, yes, but it was hers to make. She didn't have to follow the path others had set for her. She could forge her own way. It wasn't going to be easy, and it wasn't going to be without sacrifice, but she could no longer ignore the truth. She wanted to live a life that was truly her own. The days passed, and Solara spent every spare moment trying to think through what she truly wanted. She wandered the palace grounds, the gardens, the quiet rooms where she had spent so many hours alone. Everywhere she looked, she saw the empire, the traditions, the pressure. But there, too, she saw the possibility of something different, a life where she could be herself, where she could make decisions for herself, and where she could choose love over duty. It wasn't an easy choice. Her father would never understand. The council would be furious. The empire could very well crumble if she chose to break tradition. The thought of walking away from the life she had known, from the people she had been raised to serve, was terrifying. But in the quiet of her heart, Solara knew what she had to do. It wasn't just about her own happiness. It was about the future. If she married someone she didn't love, someone she didn't trust, she would never be able to lead with conviction. She would always be a puppet to the whims of others, never truly free to shape the empire as she saw fit. But if she chose to live for herself, if she chose to stand by someone who cared for her, someone who believed in her, then perhaps the empire could be stronger for it. Perhaps it could thrive under a ruler who was not just bound by duty, but also by love and passion. And so, Solara made her decision. The following week, the royal ball was held again. It was a grand affair, filled with diplomats, suitors, and members of the council. Solara knew what was expected of her. She knew the moment she entered the room, all eyes would be on her. The suitors, the advisors, her father, they would all be waiting for her to make her choice. And for once, she wasn't afraid. As she entered the grand ballroom, the light from the chandeliers reflected off the polished floors, casting a soft glow over the guests. The room was filled with laughter, conversation, and the clinking of glasses. But as soon as Solara stepped into the room, everything fell silent. All eyes turned to her. She could feel the weight of their gaze, the expectations pressing down on her shoulders. She stood tall, her silver hair flowing around her shoulders, her green eyes bright and unwavering. For the first time in her life, she didn't feel like a prisoner. She didn't feel like she was wearing a crown made of iron. She felt free. Solara's father stood at the center of the room, his expression unreadable as he watched her approach. She could see the tension in his shoulders, the worry in his eyes. He knew without a doubt that this moment would change everything. "Father," she said, her voice steady but filled with emotion, "I have made my decision." King Ulthar's eyes narrowed, his face hardening. "Solara, you must understand this is not just about you. It is about the future of the empire. Your choice will affect us all." Solara looked around the room, her gaze settling on the suitors, the advisors, the guests. They were all waiting for her decision. She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment. This was it. This was the choice that would define her future. "I understand, Father," she said, "but this is also about me, about who I am, and I refuse to marry someone just for the sake of alliances and politics. I won't live my life like that." Her father's eyes flashed with anger, but Solara held his gaze. She wasn't going to back down. This was her life, her future, and she was going to choose it for herself. "I will marry no one from this court," Solara continued, her voice unwavering. "Instead, I will marry James Connors, the human diplomat from Earth." The room erupted into chaos. The advisors gasped, the suitors murmured in disbelief, and her father's face turned pale with shock. Solara could hear the whispers swirling around her, but she didn't care. She stood tall, unshaken, her decision made. James stepped forward from the crowd, his presence calm and steady. He had been watching from the side, his expression one of quiet confidence. Solara could see the approval in his eyes, the pride, and something else, something deeper. Love. He wasn't there for power, for status. He was there because he believed in her, because he saw her as she truly was. "Your Highness," James said, his voice carrying across the room. "I promise you I will stand by your side whatever happens. We will face this together." Solara smiled at him, her heart swelling with affection. She had made her choice, and it was the right one. No matter the consequences, no matter the challenges they would face, she knew that this was the path she had to take. King Ulthar stepped forward, his voice sharp and filled with authority. "Solara, you cannot be serious, a human. This will bring disgrace to our family. The council will never approve. You are making a grave mistake." Solara met his gaze, her eyes steady and filled with determination. "Perhaps, Father, it is time for the Empire to change. Perhaps it is time for us to stop making choices based on power and tradition. I will not live my life in fear of what others expect of me. I will live it with the person I choose, the one who sees me for who I am." Her father's expression softened, though it was clear he was still struggling with the decision. "You are the future of this empire, Solara. This is not a decision to be taken lightly." "I understand, Father," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "But I am more than just the future of the Empire. I am Solara, and I will decide my future." The room fell silent, the weight of her words sinking in. There was no turning back now. Her decision had been made, and there would be no going back to the life she had known. The days that followed were filled with tension and uncertainty. The council was furious, and many of the suitors withdrew their offers, insulted by Solara's choice. But through it all, James remained by her side, his support unwavering. They faced the challenges together, navigating the political landscape with grace and determination. And slowly, over time, the empire began to change. Solara's choice was controversial, but it sparked something in the people. It sparked hope, the hope that perhaps change was possible. Maybe the empire didn't have to be bound by old traditions. Maybe it could be a place where individuals could make their own choices, where love could be valued just as much as duty. Solara and James became a symbol of that change. Their marriage, though initially met with resistance, became a beacon of hope for those who believed in a future where people were free to choose their own paths. Years later, when Solara stood before her people, ready to address the galaxy, she knew she had made the right choice. Her heart was full, her mind clear, and her future, at last, was her own.